What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I don't work for anyone. I'm self-dependent. But my job on YouTube is to tell the facts on historical boxing. I've given you examples with videos from the past. But I have to get deeper into the archives of the reality of what this game is. There seems to be misinformation on why things are happening the way they happen. And as I do my project, I don't want to sit on the sidelines and not be truthful 100% on what I truly know about what this game truly is. I'm going to go back to 1619, Jamestown, Virginia, when slaves were docked after they were captured from the continent of Africa. They were separated from their family. Out went the old, and stayed the young. Half of the slaves were thrown off the ships, fed to the sharks, because they were sick. You're talking months, with over 30 to 50 slaves in one cage. 12 inches from back to head were the bunks that they would sleep on. Of course they'll be sick. They would eat the slops and the remaining scraps of what the sailors didn't eat. That would be considered chum when you were fishing. But that's what was given to the slaves. As they came over and separated from their family, and the old were separated from the young, females separated from the males, they were bred to believe that the light skin and the dark skin were enemies of one another. They would tell one slave that another slave told them a story that only that one slave could know. It was manipulation tactics that were being used. And so they became enemies of one another. So you would then have slaves that were put in the house to mention what was happening in the fields, because they were able to sleep in the barn when others can sleep in the fields. When you slept in the house, you ate better. You dressed better. Once again, manipulation tactics. But slaves have always designed new inventions. They always got the sharecroppers out of trouble. They would go into the wars as Tuskegee Airmen, black soldiers, would fight in the 9th, 10th, 25th, 24th, and 38th Regiment. They engaged in the America's Indian War, Spanish-American War, the Philippines-American War, Mexican Border War, World War I and World War II, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. September 21st of 1866, the 10th Cavalry Regiment formed out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. These black war heroes were known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were placed on the front lines for the country who had no equal rights for them. And they would be victorious majority of the times. These soldiers were segregated from white soldiers. Now, the Third Parliament Act of October 24th, 1806, lasted 138 days to April 25th, 1807. 1807. This was April 29th of April 07. Lord Justice Greensfield was responsible for the abolishment of the slave trade in Europe. As Abraham Lincoln, January 1st, 1862, was responsible for the Emancipation and Proclamation Act, with 3.5 million black free slaves during the American Civil War. Well, after the Parliament Act, this will allow the opportunity for the first American fighter to come overseas. Bill Richmond was that first fighter. He would then become the first trainer of America. He would train the second fighter of America to become the first fighter of America to fight for a world title. Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux are the two men that I am referring to. Tom Molyneux went 33 rounds with Tom Cribb in one of the most unjustifiable robberies in European history. George Dixon would discover zone fighting, backdoor fighting. He discovered the shadow box, speed bag, heavy bag, and gloves. He was the first fighter to win a title overseas. Dixon was a Canadian bantamweight and featherweight champion. He was probably one of the greatest fighters of his day. He was hated and used by the establishment. Between battle royales and death matches, fighting to the death. What that meant was, he and another fighter, it would be usually two black fighters, and both of them had one hand that was tied to the other. And their free hand would be wrapped in stones and glass and sharp nails. And they would have to fight one another with one arm attached to the other fighter's arm. And it was called fight to the death matches. He participated in two of them, meaning only one man can guarantee to come out alive. That's not in your history books. George Dixon fought in many battle royales. He had over 1,000 fights, many unrecorded. He was a bantamweight champion when he would go overseas and take on Nuke Wallace. He became the featherweight champion when he took on Kyle McCarthy. And he would be a 3-time featherweight champion. He would defend those titles a record of 25 times, tied with Joe Louis and Harry Wills. They were all champions in their day. Dixon fought between Reconstruction and Jim Crow as he watched hanging, lynching, his peers picking cotton and serving others that didn't love them back. The first black world lightweight champion, Joe Gans, discovered the 1-2 combination punch, which is the main tool that is used to this day. He would move and jab, with lateral movement being the key word. His jab was discovered by his left hand constantly poking at flies as a slab of meat would be hung to attract the flies. He would jab and catch 10 at a time, 3 at a time, with accuracy. If you ever tried to catch a fly, one of the most impossible things to do unless you know the technique. Unfortunately, Joe Gans would take dives because he would have notes that would be wrapped around stones thrown into his window, as many black fighters did. The KKK would be heard riding off. Saddest moment was when Joe Gans lost on a foul in Goldfield, Nevada, in the longest championship match to this day that lasted 42 rounds. Joe Gans would take on battling Nelson and Jimmy Britt, where he had to do business. He had to compromise his skills and his integrity because he was threatened that if he won the fight, he would be assassinated. And if he lost the fight, he would also be assassinated. So losing on a foul would be his only way out. He fought as champion 1902 to 1908, and he would suffer from tuberculosis. Well, the reason why Jack Johnson, who was the first black heavyweight champion, was so despised is because he became champion the same year that Joe Gans would lose his lightweight championship title. They were trying to get rid of Joe Gans. And here comes the first black heavyweight champion. In England, the color line would really take effect because Jack Johnson was given money as a promotion to get a fight with Tommy Burns. And the agreement was that once he became champion, Sam Langford would get a first shot at that opportunity. The Barbados Demon Joe Walcott was the first black welterweight champion. His brother Belfil Walcott was threatened because he himself would not take a dive with Dixie Kidd. And Joe Walcott was robbed. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1904, when he faced Dixie Kidd, 20 rounds. The referee would bet on Dixie Kidd. And it wasn't until the end of the fight, the end of the 20th round, was when he would disqualify Joe Walcott and give Dixie Kidd a title that Joe Walcott worked hard for. Joe Walcott would knock out Joe Chowinski in 7 rounds, February 23rd, 1901. Dave Holly, George Cole, Black Bill, Young Peter Jackson, Mysterious Billy Smith, Tommy West, George Gunther, Bobby Dobbs, Frank Childs, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Larry Temple, Joe Gans, Sam Langford, Dan Creedon, Mike Twin Sullivan, Tommy Coleman, George Compartier, Mike Donovan, just a few of the names that the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott, would be in a ring with. Joe Walcott was a wrestler / MMA fighter at the beginning. As he lived in Boston, he would take in Jack Johnson as a roommate, and he would teach him what he knew. But some of the names that I mentioned to you that Joe Walcott was in a ring with, George Compartier, he was a light heavyweight champion. Professor Mike Donovan was a once middleweight champion. Joe Gans, the first black lightweight champion. Sam Langford was a 5-time colored heavyweight champion. Dan Creedon was a European champion. You see, Mike Twin Sullivan would get a crack at the middleweight champion, a fighter who fought Sam Langford once and was promising him a second opportunity, but he would get shot, unfortunately, that year of 1910 by Walter Dipley. His name was Stanley Ketchum. Bobby Dobbs was a colored lightweight champion. Tommy West was a welterweight champion. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien was a light heavyweight champion. Larry Temple discovered the bolo punch. Young Peter Jackson fought Sam Langford for the vacant colored middleweight champion. You see, it's not even how many fights you have, it's who you fought during your era. Barbados Demon Joe Walcott is no exception. I speak of Sam Langford, who was a one-time colored and European middleweight champion. He was a black world heavyweight champion. He took on Klondike Kings. Australian world heavyweight champion. Mexican world heavyweight champion. A 5-time colored heavyweight champion. I ask you, why didn't Sam Langford get an opportunity at a heavyweight championship title, at a middleweight championship title, at the light heavyweight championship title? You see, Sam Langford was the only fighter, black or white, the first black lightweight champion in Joe Gans, the first black fighter to become a world welterweight champion, and the Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, the first black fighter to become a middleweight champion, and Theodore Tiger Flowers. The first black heavyweight champion, and that would be Jack Johnson. No other fighter has ever done that. And if you know the career of Sam Langford, who I have him ranked number one as the greatest fighter of all times, you'll understand. You see, Sam Langford would fight the first two and only colored light heavyweight champions, Kid Norfolk, who was William Ward, and Lee Anderson, who was the Harlem Bully. He would face Joe Jeanette, Harry Wells, Sam McVeigh, Jack Johnson, Belfort Walcott, George Cole, Larry Temple, Tiger Smith, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, battling Jim Johnson, who would be the only man who would face Jack Johnson for the heavyweight championship title. Battling Jim Johnson was a black fighter. Langford faced George King Cotton, Jack Blackburn, Dave Holly, George Gunther, Dixie Kid, Blackfoot Simmons, who's known to the boxing community as Kid Monday, Klondike Haynes, Cleve Hawkins, Jamaica Kid, John Thompson, Bill Tate, Stonewall Allen, also known as Lowdown. You had Jack McVeigh, who was the colored middleweight champion. He would become the colored middleweight champion because Theodore Tiger Flowers would become the first black middleweight champion in boxing history, who also was the first black fighter to fight at New York's Madison Square Garden as the champion. Larry Estridge would defeat Panama Joe Gans, and he would lose recognition as colored middleweight champion when Theodore Tiger Flowers would become champion. But Jack McVeigh would become the successor, and he would lose his title and one of the most anticipated outside of Joe Butler in the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Panama Joe Gans was a magnificent fighter. Larry Estridge would lose recognition. But Jack McVeigh and Harry Smith, the Harlem Thunderbolt, would face one another 1929 at the Harlem Athletic Club. One of the most forgotten fights, one of the most inspirational fights in boxing history. In 1909, Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette would have one of the greatest heavyweight championship fights of all times. They were fighting for the colored heavyweight championship title that Jack Johnson would relinquish. In 49 rounds. Joe Jeanette went down 27 times. Sam McVeigh 11 times. He couldn't breathe. They had to put a paper bag over his head just to get oxygen. They poured buckets of water over the head of Joe Jeanette. Joe Jeanette was known as the Iron Man of West Hoboken. You see, Sam Langford and many of his peers would be threatened or lose opportunities of paydays if they will overwhelm their opponents. I shared the story, and it is true. of men who would be in the back of a wagon with hoods over their heads and brought into the deep woods, not knowing who they were going to fight, not knowing if they were supposed to win or they were supposed to lose. They watched men hung with men on horses on either side of the ring. In many cases, both sides of the ring with shotguns, facing them and them only the entire time they were fighting. And as they look up to the skies and to the heavens, they would look at the top of the trees and see men hanging. This happened many times. Their battle royales. Daniel Knox was the first colored champion. And they would be laughing stocks because they would have pumpkins that would be carved out, placed on their heads, as they're trying to find the man who's trying to hit them back. As drunken white men would throw coins at them. Jack McVeigh faced Harry Smith, who was known as the Harlem Thunderbolt, at the Harlem Athletic Club, November 16, 1929. It was a unanimous 15-round decision. You see, Harry Smith, who was my favorite middleweight champion of all times, he stood 6'1", weighed 155 to 175 and 3/4 pounds. The contest took place in 1929. But he ended his amateur career in 1928 with a record of 65-0 with 55 knockouts. He can hit like Julian Jackson. He was managed by Dave Brown. And Dave Brown would offer Mickey Walker, the toy bulldog, $50,000 for an opportunity, and Mickey Walker refused to give Harry Smith a fair shot, a fair opportunity to make a living for his family. Maxie Rosenblum was given similar offer, and he turned down the fight and didn't give Harry Smith a fair opportunity to earn a living for his family. At that time, you had 3 black fighters in the top 5. William Gorilla Jones, Harry Smith, and Lynn Johnson. Lynn Johnson would end the act of 24, where if you had 1 ounce of black blood in your system, in Europe, you couldn't fight for a title. Mickey Walker would lie to Lynn Johnson and told him if you took on Scotland's Tommy Milliken, I would give you a shot. Tommy Milliken wouldn't fight him because of the rule of 24. Lynn Johnson had to go over to Australia and take on Nate Collins. He would defeat him. He would become the British Empire, Commonwealth middleweight champion. But as soon as he came back over to Europe, they stripped him of his title because he was not worthy as far as they were concerned, the British Boxing Board of Control, to wear a strap around his waist. So he entered the board 6 terms until they finally let him on because they kept rejecting him as a black man. And when he got on the board, took some doing, but he would get the laws changed. And that's why you have Anthony Joshua. And that's why you would have Nigel Benn. And that's why you would have Du Bois and many of them. Dick Tiger, who was the first black fighter to win a title. Randy Turpin, the first black middleweight champion of European descent. Contributions of black fighters has been overlooked. But there were many men, as I end this part of my conversation, I'll pick up on the next video. Detroit's O'Neal Bell, Alan Faulkner of Buffalo, Indian Death Payne, Billy Sweet Pea Peacock of Philadelphia, Bobby Green of Philadelphia. You had a fighter by the name of Charlie Early, not Burley, Early, who weighed 147 pounds. He was out of San Francisco. Very good middleweight he was. He was avoided. You had Broadway Oakland Billy Smith. You had Kid Norfolk, Al Walker, Elmer Violent Ray, Wallace Cross and Big Boy Brown, Al Gaynor and Roscoe Tallis, George Godfrey, the Leaperville Shadow, Obie Walker, Eddie Bookman. You had Booker Beckworth and Turkey Thompson. You had Danny Cox, who many don't remember, Lem Franklin, Larry One Punch Williams. Boy, you had Kid Chocolate and Black Bill. You see, that was the first wave. And then we talked about the second wave of Black Murderers Row. I'll see you on the next video.